Imagine standing barefoot on frozen mud, in the middle of a bitter medieval winter. The wind slices through the holes in your only tunic. Snow is falling and you have no socks, no thermal underwear, no central heating, just the sound of your teeth chattering and the distant howl of wolves. And yet, somehow, you survive. But how? How did ordinary people, peasants and farmers, blacksmiths and monks, survive the merciless cold of winter when their daily clothing was closer to a sack than a jacket? When their homes were drafty, poorly insulated, and shared with livestock? You've probably been told that medieval life was short, miserable, and brutally cold. But that's not the full story. Because medieval people, despite everything, developed ingenious, resourceful, and sometimes downright bizarre ways to keep warm. Ways that most modern people would never consider. Ways that don't include socks. Because for most of the medieval world, socks were a luxury. This is not just a history of winter. It's a story of survival. A tale of wool, fire, superstition, architecture, and pure human stubbornness. And it begins, like many cold nights did in the Middle Ages, beside the fire. But first, let's get rid of a myth. People didn't just sit around freezing all day. They moved, constantly. They walked, worked, climbed, carried, hauled. You want to survive the cold? Move your body. That's what medieval peasants knew. A sedentary person freezes. A working one sweats, even in December. Medieval winter survival wasn't about luxury. It was about layers, motion, and clever adaptation. Take clothing, for example. Wool was king. Thick, oily, heavy wool. It didn't just warm the body. It resisted water, blocked wind, and even kept heat when damp. Poor villagers might not own much, but almost every one of them had access to wool. Even when it was scratchy or filled with lice. The idea was simple. Layer as much as possible. An undertunic, an overtunic, maybe a hooded cloak called a cowl. And beneath all that, nothing. No socks. No underwear unless you were rich. Bare skin against fabric, with every layer working like insulation in a medieval thermos. And don't picture villagers sleeping alone in icy huts. They slept together. Families, children, even animals. Huddled in one room. Shared heat, shared breath. Not romantic, practical. A body next to yours meant one less degree of deadly chill. But the real secret wasn't just layering clothes or group sleeping. It was architecture. Medieval homes in colder regions were designed with heat in mind, in surprisingly clever ways. Small, low doors trapped warmth. Thick walls made of mud, timber, or stone kept heat in. Roofs were steep to prevent snow buildup, and thatched for insulation. And most importantly, animals were kept inside. Yes, cows, chickens, goats. Your barn and your bedroom? Same place. Their body heat warmed your home. Their waste fueled your compost. And their constant presence reminded you that you weren't alone. And fireplaces? Rare in peasant homes. Chimneys were even rarer. Most had central hearths. A pit in the middle of the room with a hole in the ceiling. Smoke filled the space. You coughed, your eyes burned, but you stayed warm. That smoke even killed bugs in the straw bedding. A double benefit. But what about at night? When you weren't moving? When your fire burned low and the wind picked up? That's when the real tricks came out. Hot stones were warmed in the fire and wrapped in cloth. People placed them at their feet under blankets, like primitive hot water bottles. Beds were sometimes shared with straw or feathers for insulation. In the richer homes, you'd find bed curtains not just decorative but functional, closed around the bed to trap heat. And beneath those blankets, people didn't sleep naked. They wore night clothes, long woolen garments, sometimes even hats. You ever sleep in a woolen cap? They did, night after night. And still no socks, because socks were expensive. Handmade, often knitted or woven by skilled artisans. A pair could take hours, even days to make. So most went without. And if they had foot coverings, they might be strips of cloth wrapped around the feet, or leather shoes stuffed with straw. Imagine waking up and putting your feet into stiff, frozen boots filled with hay. But that was normal, because in medieval times, comfort was optional. Survival wasn't. And the cold wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. People believed winter was a time when the world grew dark, both literally and metaphorically. Spirits were restless. The nights were long, the days short, and the church reminded everyone that suffering was part of life. Warmth was not guaranteed. It was earned. Through work, prayer, and humility, superstition crept into how people handled the cold. Some believed wearing certain charms or herbs could keep the chill away. Others thought the cold was punishment for sin. In remote villages, strange rituals took place. Fires lit at crossroads, incantations whispered at midnight, offerings left to the spirits of frost. And when all else failed, there was alcohol. Ale and mead flowed year-round, but in winter they became essential. Not just for warmth, but for calories. Bread might freeze, crops didn't grow, but fermented grain, that kept people alive. Even children drank weak ale instead of water, which could be polluted. And monks brewed strong winter alesh to fight the cold and the dark. Still think you're tough for walking outside without a jacket? Try surviving January in a hut with a dirt floor, frozen water bucket, and zero modern conveniences. And yet people did. Century after century, they invented mittens with one hole for 4 fingers and a thumb, easier to make and warmer. They sewed felted soles into shoes. They lined cloaks with fur when they could afford it. They burned peat when wood was scarce. They even built their homes facing the sun for passive solar heating, long before that term ever existed. This wasn't mindless suffering. It was adaptation. In some towns, public bathhouses doubled as winter refuges. Not just for bathing, but for warmth. People gathered, shared heat, told stories. In monasteries, stone floors were covered with thick rugs, and monks warmed their hands over candles while copying manuscripts. And in castles, they had braziers, portable metal pans filled with coals, carried from room to room like a medieval space heater. But let's not romanticize it. Frostbite was real. People died of exposure. Babies froze in their sleep. And if a roof caved under snow, your whole family could vanish in an avalanche of silence. The cold was not a joke. It shaped life. It dictated when people rose, worked, and rested. It decided when wars were fought or not. It influenced diet, marriage timing, childbirth, and even burial. Winter meant storing food, preparing clothing, and praying the harvest had been enough. There was no margin for error, and yet somehow, without socks, they endured. Not because they liked the cold, but because they had no other choice. It's easy to imagine medieval winters as lifeless, gray, and still. But that illusion vanishes the moment you picture a village waking up before dawn. The sky still black, the frost clinging to the beams of thatched roofs, and smoke already curling from the hearths, struggling against the wind. Inside the homes, the cold is not defeated. It is bargained with. A child, maybe 7 years old, is the first to stir. Not by choice. He's sent by his mother to feed the animals before light. The straw on the ground is icy and brittle. The bucket he carries is half frozen. But he doesn't complain. He wraps his tattered cloak tighter, rubs his hands together, and moves. That movement, that constant motion, was one of the most powerful defenses medieval people had. Whether you were kneading bread, chopping wood, herding sheep, or hauling stones, your own muscles became your furnace. The wealthiest had other options. Noblemen and royalty draped themselves in fur, beaver, squirrel, even ermine. Not for luxury, for insulation. Fur-lined cloaks, fur boots, fur hats. Layers so thick you could barely walk. And still, many of them huddled by the fire for hours, doing nothing but waiting for spring. In castles, tapestries weren't just decorations. They were insulation, hung across cold stone walls. Sometimes even from the ceilings, they trapped warmth and dulled the bite of winter winds. In large halls, fires roared in huge hearths, yet the opposite end of the room might still be freezing. To warm your hands, you held a stone mug of hot ale. To warm your feet, you tucked them under a dog. Not a joke. Foot warmers weren't always metal boxes filled with coals. They were animals. Living, breathing, furry heaters. But the real magic happened at night. As twilight fell, people prepared for the deep freeze. Fires were carefully banked, covered in ash so the coals would last through the night. Embers, not flames. Enough to relight in the morning, without burning down the house. And then came the blankets. Not the soft cotton ones, you know. These were heavy, rough, and layered with straw, fur, or wool. The bed wasn't a place of comfort, it was a defensive position. You burrowed into it like a soldier under siege. And if you were lucky, someone burrowed in with you. The idea of sleeping alone in your own room? That was foreign. Even in wealthier homes, servants often slept near their master's quarters for warmth. Privacy was a luxury far below survival. Now let's talk about boots, or the lack of them. In many rural areas, people went barefoot even in cold months, especially children. Calloused feet and frost-numbed toes were part of growing up. Some wrapped cloth around their feet. Others used wooden pattens, elevated soles strapped to bare feet or soft shoes. These kept your feet out of the snow, mostly, but not warm. There were stories, chilling ones, of travelers losing toes in the forest, of pilgrims with blackened feet arriving at monasteries, begging for help, of entire villages isolated by snow, melting it just to drink, wrapped in whatever they could find. But the ingenuity never stopped. In Scandinavia, wooden clogs were stuffed with straw. In Russia, people wore felted boots made of pressed wool called valenki. In the Alps, sheepskin was wrapped around the legs and tied with leather cords. And in England, layers of foot wraps soaked in lard were common. Not pleasant, but effective. Even the food changed with the season. Hearty stews, hot porridge, root vegetables, dried meat, anything to keep the body fueled and generate internal warmth. Spices, when available, were valued not just for taste, but for their warming properties, believed to fight the chill from the inside. In monasteries, monks followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which dictated strict routines regardless of season. Rising in the dark, chanting prayers in unheated chapels, walking across cold stone barefoot or in thin sandals. Their suffering was spiritual, but many adapted. Woolen habits, layered robes, hooded cowls. Silence, yes, but not stupidity. And yet, despite all efforts, people still died. Winter brought with it not only frostbite, but disease. Cold, damp, and close quarters meant infections spread. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, fevers with no names and no cures. Medicine was limited. Warmth, in many cases, was the only treatment available. And sometimes even that failed. But the people didn't give up. They sang. They drank. They told stories. They gathered in the dim corners of taverns and churches, trying to forget the cold, even just for a few hours. Music was not just entertainment, it was warmth for the soul. And firelight did more than illuminate. It became a symbol of defiance. A single flame against a world of ice. When a child was born in winter, it was a miracle. When a harvest lasted through February, it was a blessing. When no one died before the snow melted, it was remembered. So how did they survive without socks? They adapted. They layered. They moved. They huddled. They built. They sang. They believed. They understood what many today forget. That warmth isn't just something you wear. It's something you create. Through action. Through community. Through persistence. And for all their suffering, there's something beautiful in that resilience. Something deeply human. A spark in the dark. Because in every freezing dawn, there was still life. Still breath. Still fire. Still hope. Imagine waking up in a wooden hut. Frost lining the inside of your only window. You slept next to your siblings, pressed tightly together, not because you wanted to, but because the alternative was shivering alone in the dark. There's a chill deep in your bones. Your breath makes clouds in the air, and still the day must begin. There's no thermostat, no insulation, only instinct, habit, and the old wisdom passed from mother to daughter, from shepherd to apprentice, from the dead to the living. You start the fire. The embers from last night are faintly glowing beneath a thin blanket of ash. You blow gently, not too hard. Too fast and you'll kill the heat. It's an art, a sacred daily ritual. When it catches, when the flames finally rise, it's as if the sun has entered the room. Now the chores. Outside, the animals are already moving. Cows must be milked before their udders freeze. The chickens must be fed, even if the water in their trough is solid ice. You trudge through snow in makeshift boots, cloth wrapped around wood, tied with twine. They barely help, but you move quickly. Motion is life. Inside, someone grinds grains into meal. Porridge is bubbling in a blackened pot. It smells like survival. Not delicious, just necessary. There's no cinnamon, no sugar, but it's hot. That's all that matters. Every movement, every choice is calculated to preserve heat. The door is opened only when needed. Water is stored inside to keep it from freezing. Pots are kept warm by the fire not for flavor, but because cold food is dangerous. Chills the core. Children are bundled in everything available. Wool, linen, fur. Clothes are rarely washed in winter, they'd freeze before they dried. So dirt and smoke become part of the wardrobe. Layers upon layers. A child might wear their father's tunic over their mother's old cloak, pinned together with bone. Not fashionable, functional, and still toes turn purple. This was normal. In the mountains, shepherds had their own methods. They built low, circular huts designed to trap heat. Inside, they kept their animals overnight. The body heat of goats, sheep, and even pigs helped warm the air. It was loud. It was dirty, but it worked. Many nomadic and rural cultures used this trick. People and animals shared the same space during the coldest months. The smell was overwhelming, but in winter, comfort took a backseat to survival. At night, the fire was never truly allowed to die. Someone always kept watch. Sparks were gold. Coals were treasure. And if the fire went out completely, panic. Reigniting it from scratch was laborious, sometimes impossible. In desperation, families ran to neighbors, carrying burning branches like sacred offerings. And sometimes, there was no neighbor to run to. During harsh winters, villages were cut off. Roads vanished under snow. Bridges collapsed. Rivers froze. It was then that people faced the true edge of survival. In one account from 14th century Germany, a traveler recorded how villagers burned their own furniture, doors, even parts of their homes to keep warm. They ate roots, bark, boiled leather. And still, some didn't make it. But from these trials came ingenuity. In Iceland, turf houses were built with thick earthen walls and roofs that insulated against brutal cold. The design was so effective, they stayed warm with minimal firewood. Inside, people gathered in one main room, sleeping close, reading sagas aloud by lamplight. In Eastern Europe, the Russian pechka stove became central to life. A massive brick oven, it heated the entire house. Some even slept on top of it, as the surface retained warmth for hours. It was a bed, a heater, a stove, a guardian against winter's bite. In Japan, people gathered around the kotatsu, a low table with a heat source underneath and a blanket draped over the frame. Families huddled together, legs tucked beneath, warmth shared and conserved. Different regions, same need, same solution, togetherness. That was the secret. You never fought the cold alone. Weddings were held in winter not despite the chill, but because of it. With farming halted, people had time to celebrate. And what better way to stay warm than a crowded hall? Bodies dancing, ale flowing, fires blazing. Communal warmth wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological, spiritual. In monasteries, monks shared cloisters that were carefully designed to minimize drafts. In some regions, warm stones were heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, placed in beds to preheat them before sleep. Others used iron or brass bed warmers, filled with embers and slid between sheets. Still others swore by warmth charms, herbs and objects believed to ward off winter spirits. Lavender, rosemary, and mugwort were burned, placed in shoes, or sewn into garments. Not for their actual temperature, but for the illusion of safety. Because sometimes warmth is just belief. The stories passed down about the winter spirits, the Yule goat, the frost demons, the night walkers, weren't just scary tales. They were coping mechanisms, ways to explain the unexplainable. Why someone froze, why someone vanished, why the baby didn't wake up. And when the snow finally melted, when the ice cracked and rivers ran again, the people didn't forget. They honored the season, with festivals, with songs, with feasts. May Day was more than springtime joy, it was a funeral for winter. Bonfires, flowers, ribbons. Rituals not of beauty, but of relief. We made it. For medieval people, surviving winter was not just about avoiding death. It was about proving that life could continue, that the darkness didn't win. They didn't have socks, but they had layers. They had each other. They had wisdom passed through generations. Wisdom we rarely notice today. We step into heated cars, into insulated buildings, drink hot coffee from electric kettles. And we forget that for thousands of years warmth wasn't given. It was earned, hour by hour, breath by breath, and that behind every frozen stone ruin we romanticize. There once lived a soul who stared down the blizzard and whispered, "Not today." There's something haunting about medieval silence in winter. No birds, no insects, just the crack of branches under weighty snow, the sigh of wind through empty trees, and the distant bark of a hungry dog. In that stillness, every sound mattered. Cough could echo like thunder. A baby's cry could cut through the cold like a blade. And then there were the wolves. When winter hit hard and prey was scarce, wolves came closer, to the edge of towns, to the very doors of cottages. The cold made everyone desperate. People told tales of wolves bold enough to stalk humans. Some were real, most were warnings, but they served a purpose, to keep you near the fire. At night, a family might huddle together under rough wool, sharing one bed. Parents, children, sometimes even neighbors. Modesty was abandoned in favor of heat. A small clay pot filled with glowing coals might be placed near their feet, primitive but effective. If the pot cracked, it could start a fire. But if you didn't try, you might wake up with frostbite, or not wake up at all. Even churches weren't safe from the cold. Medieval cathedrals were marvels of stone and glass, but they were freezing. Priests preached in fur-lined robes. Parishioners wore gloves during Mass. Some brought foot warmers hidden beneath their skirts or cloaks. Candles burned constantly, not for light, but to keep fingers from stiffening. But in monasteries, things were more disciplined. Monks endured. Prayer hours happened on schedule before sunrise, in the coldest hours of the day. They chanted through breath turned to mist, fingers red and raw. It was a form of sacrifice. The chill was penance. And yet, even they found ways to fight back. Warm hoods, extra robes, heated stones, secret sips of hot mead. Silent acts of mercy in a world that did not forgive weakness. Out in the countryside, travelers had their own dangers. Roadside inns were rare. If you couldn't find one before nightfall, you had two choices. Sleep in the open and risk freezing, or knock on a stranger's door and hope for kindness. There's a medieval proverb that says, "A closed door in winter is a death sentence." Hospitality wasn't just a virtue, it was a social contract. You shared warmth because you knew one day you might be the one knocking. Those who could afford it carried small metal braziers with coals to warm their hands during travel. Some wore cloaks so large they could wrap around their entire bodies like tents. Others rode close together, using the heat of the horses and each other to stay alive. In cities, life in winter was no less brutal. Streets became rivers of slush and waste. Frozen sewage cracked underfoot. Chimneys puffed constantly, their black smoke choking the skyline. Families stayed indoors, crammed into single rooms, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and illness. But within that closeness came resilience. Children learned to play indoor games with carved bones, cloth dolls, and painted pebbles. Women spun wool beside the fire, their fingers flying faster the colder it got. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, and told stories, long ones. Stories were fuel for the soul. Even markets adapted. Vendors sold hot drinks, thin ale, boiled milk, herbal infusions. Roasted nuts. Hot porridge in bowls you could barely afford. These things weren't luxuries. They were survival disguised as trade. The rich, of course, lived differently. In castles and manor houses, entire wings were sealed off during winter. No point heating what couldn't be used. Fires were stoked constantly. Servants carried hot bricks wrapped in cloth from hearths to beds. Entire households rotated around the presence of fire, like orbiting a sun. And yet, cold still found its way in. There are letters from nobles complaining of frozen ink, of breath fogging indoors, of boots stiff with frost even in the king's hall. Warmth was a daily battle, no matter your rank. For those who worked outside, blacksmiths, millers, masons, there was no escape. They worked with numbed hands and cracked skin, wrapped in whatever they could find. Some made primitive gloves by wrapping cloth and leather around their fingers. Others relied on speed, get the work done, then get back to the fire. But firewood was precious. Forests were carefully managed. In some regions, cutting wood without permission was punishable by death. Entire families survived on a single cart of wood for months, learning to burn slowly, efficiently. Some burned peat or dry dung when wood was scarce. In some alpine villages, firewood was so valuable that they assigned official fire watchers, people who ensured no one wasted it or stole extra bundles. And in places where even that wasn't an option, people burned whatever they had. Old carts, broken tools, thatch from abandoned homes. Desperation makes anything flammable. But again, people adapted. Some medieval homes were built partially underground, not for protection from enemies but from the cold. Earth holds warmth. Dugouts and semi-subterranean homes stayed several degrees warmer than the open air. In the harshest climates, they made the difference between life and death. In places like Mongolia, yurts were insulated with thick felt. The fire in the center kept the entire space warm. In Scandinavia, smokehouses doubled as shelters. In the Arctic, indigenous people had already perfected igloos, structures so well designed they could stay at 0 degrees Celsius inside, even when it was minus 40 degrees Celsius outside. And all without socks. Not because they didn't want them, but because they had something more important: knowledge. They knew how to make warmth last, how to read the wind, how to cover the skin without suffocating it, how to walk without falling, how to gather without freezing. They respected the cold, not feared it, not challenged it, just worked with it, because they had to, because behind every winter was another spring. And to reach it, you only needed one thing: to endure. You might think the hardest part of medieval winter was the cold itself. But in truth, it was the waiting. Winter wasn't just a season. It was a test. A 4-month interrogation of your planning, your strength, your faith, and your luck. Every day asked a question. Did you store enough food? Did you patch the roof properly? Did you anger the spirits? Will the sun return? In a world governed by the natural cycle, time moved differently in winter. Slowly, suspended. Days were short, nights endless. And with that darkness came thoughts, fear, regret, memory, and ghosts. Medieval people believed that winter was when the boundary between the living and the dead thinned. They said the wild hunt rode through the skies during snowstorms, ghostly riders collecting lost souls. Some claimed to hear them. Galloping hooves, distant howls, horns blown in the night. You stayed inside not just because of wolves, but because of things far older. People protected themselves with ritual. Iron hung over doors, charms above the hearth, sprigs of evergreen tucked behind icons. Fire wasn't just heat. It was sacred, kept the old things away. But fear had practical value too. Children who feared being taken by frost demons were less likely to wander into blizzards. Those who believed in cursed snow avoided traveling at night. Sometimes myth saves more lives than logic. Winter turned everyone into storytellers. By candlelight, families retold the same legends each year. Of villagers who got lost in a snowstorm and were led back by a glowing fox. Of grandmothers who stitched invisible warmth into coats. Of lovers who froze hand in hand beneath the moon. Every tale a memory, every lie a lesson. And in the middle of that, real life continued. Births, deaths, accidents, miracles. A midwife would brave waist-deep snow to reach a woman in labor. A shepherd might lose half his flock in a sudden freeze. A hunter might return with nothing but frostbite, or a deer that meant everyone would eat well for a week. In some regions, Entire villages gathered to butcher and preserve meat in one coordinated effort. It was loud, messy, and joyful. Every part of the animal used, every bone a blessing. Blood sausage, smoked cuts, cured hams, these weren't luxuries. They were preservation methods honed by centuries of trial and error. Nothing was wasted. Not in winter. People collected snow and ice to keep food cold longer. They stored barrels underground where temperatures stayed stable. Pickling, drying, fermenting, salting, each technique learned through generations of mistakes. And sometimes, even warmth came from the unexpected. Fermentation created heat. In some wine cellars and breweries, that warmth was redirected, used to dry clothes or heat water. Bakers often slept near their ovens. Some city workers, like tanners or potters, stayed warm thanks to the processes of their trades. Even human waste had a role. In large enough piles, compost generates heat. Some medieval farms used manure not just for fertilizer, but to insulate barns or even warm small greenhouses. It was innovation born of necessity. They didn't have thermometers, but they knew how to feel the air and predict the weather. They couldn't measure calories, but they knew which meals kept you strong longer. They had no synthetic fabrics, but they layered materials so effectively that snow melted on the outside without touching the skin. In places like Scotland and Ireland, cloaks were woven thick, with water-repellent lanolin still inside the wool. Some were so dense they could be used as blankets, tents, or bedding. In the Norse world, fur was layered with linen to prevent sweat from freezing next to the body. Reindeer hide, bear pelts, seal skin, materials chosen not just for status, but for how they performed under wind, snow, and silence. And still they danced. Even in the deepest cold, people found reasons to celebrate. Yule, Carnival, Candlemas, festivals of light, warmth, and survival. Songs were sung that had nothing to do with joy, but everything to do with defiance. To sing in the cold was to say, "I am still here." They jumped over fires, told riddles, exchanged tokens. Sometimes they wore masks, part costume, part magical protection. A way to laugh at the cold, to mock death, to remind the season, "You may freeze my hands, but not my spirit." In noble courts, the season brought performances. Minstrels, jesters, masked balls. Warmth not from fire, but from spectacle. A kind of distraction. And in a way, a very human coping mechanism. In peasant cottages, warmth came from something simpler. Shared silence. A lull in the evening, when everyone sat close, said nothing, and listened to the creak of beams, the snap of firewood, the wind outside. That silence was more profound than any church service. Said, "We made it another day." And so day turned to night, and night turned to another morning. And each time the sun rose just a little earlier. They watched the shadows, measured the change, marked the days. They knew, as surely as they knew their own names, that spring would come. It always had. It always would. But only for those who endured. Endurance. That was the true winter miracle. Not the strength to fight, but the strength to wait. To survive without socks was never about bravery. It was about adaptability, about learning where to place your feet, when to speak, when to be still, when to let go of comfort in favor of life. And so, with layers worn thin, with firewood low, and food running out, they endured. Because they had to. Because they knew that warmth was not a gift. It was a craft, a memory, a story passed in whispers by firelight. And now you've heard it too. Imagine waking up and the first thing you feel isn't the sun, or even your own breath, but the weight of frost on your eyebrows. Your blanket is stiff with cold. The water in your wooden cup is frozen solid. Your fingers, curled against your chest all night, unfold with pain. And still you rise. Because in the medieval world, winter did not care if you were tired. It did not care if you were sick. The animals needed feeding. The fire needed tending. The snow needed shoveling. If you waited for comfort, you'd die waiting. So people created rhythm, a daily pattern to keep life moving. Rise, stoke the fire, break the ice on the water trough, feed the animals, warm the bread, wrap your feet, pray, work, And even in bitter cold, the human body adjusts. After the first few weeks of winter, people reported their skin toughening, their breath steadying, their hunger stabilizing. It didn't get easier, it just became familiar. They knew how to move without wasting heat, how to breathe slowly to warm the lungs, how to cover the mouth with wool to prevent icy air from slicing the throat. All learned, not taught. Children mimicked their elders. Not just the gestures, but the pace, the awareness, the instinct to check the fire, to watch for frost on the walls, to feel the air with the back of the hand. No thermometer, no weather app, just wisdom passed through observation. And there was beauty, too, the kind that only appears when survival sharpens the senses. Sunlight on ice-covered branches, the silence of snowfall, the sudden warmth of a stranger's smile, a single orange brought out at Christmas, the rare gift of a dry pair of mittens. Small things mattered more. A wooden spoon warmed in hot broth, a dog curling at your feet, a whisper of steam from your breath as you spoke softly in the night. There was no hygge, no philosophy of coziness, just a raw awareness that every comfort had been earned. And in that came a kind of pride. The pride of a mother who could feed 5 children with a pot of barley and scraps. The pride of a father who kept the roof patched through snow and wind. The pride of the elderly, who survived yet another winter, and had stories to prove it. Because age was a triumph. To grow old in a world where cold could take a baby in the night, where fever could steal a toddler before sunrise, that was victory. And the elderly were revered, not for wealth, not for beauty, but for endurance. For having faced 1,000 frozen mornings and still being able to say, I remember. And what they remembered mattered. They remembered the years when snow came in October, when the river froze so thick you could march an ox across it, when wolves howled at the edge of the village and someone didn't come home. They remembered the little miracles, too, the time a stranger offered shelter without asking a name, the warmth of a shared meal when stores were empty, the laughter that echoed in a cottage so cold the walls cracked. They knew what modern people often forget, that survival isn't about conquering nature. It's about partnership, respect, patience, and sometimes surrender, because winter will always be stronger than you. But if you listen, if you learn its language, you can live with it. And so, they built lives in harmony with frost and fire. They understood where the sun would rise and when it would touch their fields. They built their homes with thick walls and small windows not to trap light, but to trap heat. They slept with dogs and goats not because it was charming, but because shared body heat might save a child's toes. And they endured not just because they had to, but because someone had shown them how. Because someone once wrapped them in wool when they were small, held their hands near the fire, taught them how to check for frostbite, showed them how to find the warmest spot in a room, not next to the fire but opposite it where the heat pooled. And when those elders were gone, their lessons remained. In the way boots were hung upside down to dry, in the way soup was stirred clockwise before dawn, in the way a window was cracked just slightly to prevent smoke from suffocating a family in sleep. Nothing written, everything remembered, because the medieval world didn't run on science. It ran on memory, on trial, on suffering transformed into knowledge. And that knowledge wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity. You could be poor but clean, cold but graceful, hungry but generous. And so, in a winter world of blistered skin and breathless winds, people still carved, still painted, still sang, still prayed. They still whispered love by firelight. They still told bedtime stories of warm lands, of summer flowers, of sun-drenched cities they had never seen. And in those stories, warmth returned, if only for a moment, because the cold could steal your toes, but not your dreams. And maybe that's why, after all the hardship, medieval people didn't remember winter as a time of endless misery. They remembered it as a time of closeness, of depth, of meaning, because when the world outside tries to take everything from you, what remains is who you really are. In the cold, truths become simpler. You learn quickly what matters and what doesn't. A bowl of hot broth matters. A roof that doesn't leak. Dry straw. A good pair of hands. And above all, community, because no one survived medieval winter alone. Villages became tighter in the cold months. The same people who might quarrel over a fence in spring would share bread in December. Not out of kindness but necessity. It was understood. If one of us freezes, we all might. So warmth was shared, not just through fire or food, but through presence. Through the sound of someone breathing beside you in the dark. Through the knowledge that if your chimney smoked wrong, someone would notice. If your animals cried strangely, someone would come. Children played in the snow until their fingers burned. And when they stumbled back into the cottage red-faced and shivering, someone older always knew what to do. They'd sit them near the fire, rub their hands, offer broth. Not with softness, but with habit. Because keeping warm wasn't a gesture, it was a responsibility. And this care extended beyond bloodlines. Orphans, widows, the sick, the elderly. In many villages, they were absorbed. A room was found, corner was cleared, an extra log was placed on the fire. To leave someone alone in winter was close to a death sentence. And in a deeply Christian world, that meant something far worse than discomfort. It meant sin. So even the poorest made space. A stranger might be invited in from the storm, given bread, water, maybe a blanket. The assumption was that it could be Christ in disguise, or a wandering soul sent to test the village's heart. And even if not, wasn't it better to be the one who gave warmth than the one who withheld it? Hospitality was sacred, and so was silence. On long winter nights, once the chores were done and the food eaten, cottages fell quiet. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the fire spoke enough. The crackling, the creaking beams, the wind outside, it became a lullaby. Children fell asleep to these sounds. Elders drifted into dreams of summers past. And in between, some stayed awake, watching the embers glow down to red. That silence was a kind of prayer. It asked nothing, promised nothing, but it wrapped around the heart like wool. And then morning would come, again, and again, and again. Even the cruelest winters eventually softened. And the signs were subtle. A drip from the eaves. The call of a bird not heard in months. A slightly longer stretch of golden light across the wall. The first thaw was not met with celebration, but with work. Snow had to be cleared, tools sharpened, dead animals buried, paths reopened, walls repaired. But even then, there was hope, because if you survived January and made it into February, your chances were good. If you had enough salt meat, enough dried apples, enough barley flour, March was survivable. And by then, the stories had grown longer, the dreams brighter, the promise of warmth no longer felt like a lie. Children would play outside again without so many layers. The snow would crunch softer, melt faster, streams would trickle, and someone somewhere would find a sprout, green, delicate, alive. And in that moment, everything changed. Because medieval people didn't need clocks or calendars. They had the earth, the smell of soil returning, the way a bird built its nest, the way a dog stretched in the sun and didn't shiver. And then the first real sunburn. The first night you didn't need to sleep with your boots on. The first time you walked outside, and the wind didn't bite. Those moments were holy. They meant that everything endured had not been in vain. You hadn't just survived. You had passed the test. But winter never truly left. It lingered in memory, in scars, in empty corners of the pantry, in the quiet morning for those who didn't make it. And so, when warmth came again, people were grateful in a way that cannot be taught. They opened their windows, their hearts, their hands. They shared what they had, not just because they could, but because they remembered. They remembered what it felt like to breathe in pain, to hold frostbitten fingers, to sit in silence and pray for morning. And so, when spring arrived, it wasn't just a season. It was a resurrection. Spring in the medieval world wasn't gentle. It didn't arrive like a soft whisper. It burst in like a cry of relief. Snow didn't melt gradually, collapsed. Rivers swelled. Roads turned to sludge. Everything that had frozen came back to life with a kind of wild, messy urgency. But for those who had survived winter without socks, it felt like magic. The ground was soggy, but walkable. Boots, many of them cracked and patched beyond recognition, sank into thawing paths. Children splashed in puddles, laughing like they had never heard their own voices outdoors before. And birds, those forgotten musicians, returned to every rooftop and branch, rehearsing their chorus like life itself depended on the sound. And maybe it did, because after months of creaking timber, howling winds, and the hush of death, spring's noise was sacred. It was proof that the earth still turned, that the sun had not abandoned them, that life continued. People opened doors, let smoke drift out and fresh air in. Bedding was unrolled, aired out, hung on fences. Cloaks were beaten, straw was replaced. Every corner cleaned, not just out of hygiene but out of ritual. It was as if they were exorcising winter. But winter left traces, not just in the home but in the body. Feet calloused from months of barefoot moments near cold stone floors. Skin pale and dry, muscles stiff. Coughs lingering from nights where smoke and frost battled for dominance in the lungs. And yet there was pride. They had made it. The children had grown. The firewood lasted. The food, though thin by the end, had not disappeared completely. And if it had, someone had shared. Someone had knocked on the door in the dark with a bundle of turnips, or a strip of dried venison. That too was remembered, and now the land could repay them. Fields were inspected. Soil was sniffed, touched, even tasted. Seeds that had slept in sacks all winter were brought into the light. Lambs stumbled beside ewes. Calves blinked against the sun. Chickens laid more. Eggs returned to the table. And fresh herbs, green, alive, found their way into the pot. It was a feast even if it was small, because freshness had been a dream. Now it was real. People smiled more easily, spoke more loudly. Even gossip felt warmer. But memory lingered. Not every cottage still stood. Not every family was whole. Some chairs remained empty not just for the season but forever. And in their absence, stories grew. He was the one who always broke the ice first in the mornings. She used to sing during storms so the children wouldn't be afraid. They gave away their last bread to a neighbor and never said a word. These stories weren't told with sadness but with reverence, because those who died in winter were never forgotten. They became part of the village's mythology. A lesson, a warning, a light, and with each new season, those who lived tried harder. They patched roofs in summer even if it was hot. They harvested more firewood than they thought they'd need. They pickled, dried, salted until the shelves groaned. Because they had learned year after year that winter always returned. That comfort was not a guarantee, but a reward. And this time, maybe, just maybe, they'd have a few more socks. Not that socks alone meant survival, but they were a symbol of preparation, of foresight, of the luxury of time. Because in the coldest months, even a sock could feel like armor. It wasn't just about fabric. It was about everything behind it. The sheep who grew the wool, the hands that spun the yarn, the fingers that stitched, late into the night, by flickering firelight, with cracked skin and tired eyes. A sock was love. A sock was memory. A sock was hope. And yet many had survived without them. They had survived through layers, through movement, through body heat, through faith. They had survived through discipline, through community, through the raw, unbreakable will to live. And that made every step into spring feel earned. Every warm breeze a blessing. Every flower a miracle. Not because they were rare, but because they had been missed. Even in spring, the cold never fully left the medieval heart. Not because the air remained bitter, but because the memory of cold was stitched into everything. It was in the way a child reached instinctively for the cloak, even as the sun warmed the fields. It was in the way a man eyed the sky, wondering how long the warmth would last. It was in the careful rationing of food, even when gardens began to bloom again. Survival taught restraint, taught humility, taught gratitude in its most brutal form. And so, even as life began to blossom again, there was no wild indulgence, no foolish waste, because every medieval person knew, winter is not the enemy you defeat. It is the teacher who returns, again and again, to test you, to take from you, to remind you, and that knowledge became a kind of spiritual armor. Even the church spoke of winter not merely as a season, but as metaphor, a time of testing, of trial, of death, followed by resurrection. Christians saw in the cycle of seasons the very pattern of faith, the descent into suffering, the silence of the grave, the miracle of return. And so prayers were not just for spring, they were for strength, to endure what must be endured, to face the frost without losing the soul. In this, peasants and nobles alike stood equal, because the cold did not care about titles. Castles could be as cruelly drafty as cottages. Stone, after all, holds cold longer than wood. And high towers, though mighty in war, were difficult to heat in winter. So even royalty suffered. Even lords and ladies knew what it meant to sleep in cloaks, to huddle close, to place a dog at the foot of the bed not for affection, but for warmth. And even their children were told, be grateful, be wise, for the frost will come again. And when it does, your wealth will not save you, only your preparation. In monasteries, monks followed strict winter rules. They rose before dawn, barefoot on cold stone, chanting through breath that fogged the air. They washed in icy water. They ate meager meals. They embraced winter as a path to discipline, because comfort to them dulled the soul. The cold sharpened it. And outside those stone walls, in the tiny villages scattered across the hills, mothers taught their daughters how to line boots with straw. Fathers taught their sons to bank a fire so it would last till morning. Nothing was taken for granted. Even the smallest warmth was a treasure. The feel of bread fresh from the oven, the scratch of wool against skin, the way a shared bowl of stew could feed not just the stomach, but the spirit. And sometimes warmth came not from heat, but from stories. Long, winding tales told by elders in the quiet of winter nights, of heroes who walked across frozen lakes, of witches who rode the wind, of spirits who guarded hearthfires, of saints who brought spring with a single touch. These stories were more than entertainment. They were instruction. Wrapped in wonder, they carried warnings, hints, lessons on how to behave when the world turns cold, how to keep the fire lit, both in the hearth and in the heart. Children listened with wide eyes. Adults listened too, though they knew the truth hidden in the tales. That monsters didn't always wear horns. That magic couldn't always save you. That sometimes survival depended not on spells, but on each other. And so winter became something more than weather. It became a forge, a test of character. And in passing through it, people emerged changed, not just physically, but spiritually. They were leaner, hungrier, wiser. They knew the weight of silence, the gift of warmth, the power of community. They understood that no one survives alone. And when they sat together in spring, beneath blossoming trees, they did not laugh at the cold as if it had been a joke. They remembered it with respect. They nodded to it, like to an old enemy who had taught them everything they needed to know. They didn't have puffer coats. They didn't have thermals or fleece or radiators. And most astonishing of all, they didn't have socks. Not the way we imagine them. Not soft, cotton-woven foot hugs that stretch and cling and warm. No, what they had was necessity. And necessity in the medieval world was more powerful than luxury. Imagine a winter morning. Your breath curls in the air the moment you stir. The thatched roof above your head leaks a thin sliver of cold light. The hearth has long since died to ash. There is no warm floor to step onto, only dirt or stone, or if you were lucky, planks slick with frost. You don't ease your way out of bed. You burst from it, because hesitation only lets the cold in deeper. You move fast because moving is the only thing that warms you. And on your feet, not socks, not even boots in many cases, just rough leather soles, tied with strips of cloth or rope, sometimes stuffed with straw, sometimes lined with wool scraps, fur if you were lucky, but rarely sewn, never elastic, and certainly not dry for long. They called them foot wraps or just rags. And they weren't always clean, but they were better than bare skin against ice. The poor, who were the majority, wore whatever they could stitch or barter. An old shirt cut down, a ruined tunic stripped to the hem, The wealthy had better options. Linen for layering, fur-lined hose, high boots imported from places where winters were even worse. But cold doesn't care about social status. It bites through layers. It seeps through gaps. It punishes exposed skin without hesitation. That's why medieval people learned not just how to dress, but how to move. Because warmth in those days was not a possession. It was a rhythm. You chopped wood, not for comfort but to keep your blood moving. You carried water because idleness meant frostbite. Children were sent out to collect twigs with stiff fingers and bright red cheeks. And indoors people sat close, not just for affection but for mutual survival. Heat shared was heat conserved. Sometimes they placed heated stones at their feet, warmed in the fire, wrapped in cloth, tucked under the skirts. Dogs were more than pets. They were heat sources. Chickens might sleep in the kitchen. Cows in the barn lent warmth to the walls. Everything that breathed, everything that moved, became part of a system. A fragile, precious circulation of warmth. And sleep was an act of engineering. You wore everything you owned to bed. You wrapped your feet in cloth, your head in a hood, your body in a cloak. Blankets were rare, quilts rarer still. So you layered. Wool, linen, leather, whatever could trap heat. You curled into yourself. Or into someone else. Whole families slept side by side. Grandparents with children. Cousins with cousins. Not out of lack of space, but to survive the night. And still, they sometimes woke with frost on their brows. It sounds cruel. It sounds unbearable. But they endured it because they had to. And strangely, they didn't complain the way we might expect. Cold wasn't just weather. It was part of life, part of faith, part of rhythm and order. Something given by God, meant to be endured, not defied. They didn't ask why it had to be this way. They asked only how to meet it with strength. Because the cold was honest. It made no promises, played no favorites. It came for the king and the beggar alike. And if you could survive it, truly survive it, you came out the other side harder, sharper, more grateful, and more alive. That's why even in churches, they never prayed for warmth alone. They prayed for the will to keep going, for courage, for fire in the soul when fire in the hearth ran low. And somehow they always found it. In the next part, we'll step deeper into how these people prepared for winter long before the first snow ever fell. Because in the medieval mind, winter wasn't just endured. It was anticipated, trained for, fought like a quiet war. The first frost never arrived as a surprise. By the time the leaves began to yellow and fall, medieval minds were already counting. Not just days, but stores, woodpiles, salted meat, dried herbs, candles, oil, grain. Because winter was a siege, and if you hadn't prepared well, you would not survive it. Autumn was a frantic ballet. Every able hand had work. Men split logs until their palms bled. Women dried root vegetables over low fires. Children plucked late berries, gathered nuts, checked traps. No one was idle. There was no luxury of rest. The cold was coming, and it demanded tribute in the form of labor. Grain was ground before the mills froze. Ale brewed before yeast could no longer rise. Slaughter came early, not in cruelty but in calculation. Animals that could not be fed through winter were culled, and nothing was wasted. Meat was smoked, organs pickled, skins cleaned for clothes, bones boiled for broth. Even the poorest household had its rituals. A hidden sack of barley, a tightly sealed pot of honey, onion strings hanging from the rafters like trophies, each one a promise. This will keep us alive. And there were deeper preparations, less visible but just as vital. Wool garments were checked for holes, lined with scraps, patched with worn sleeves. Boots were resoled with whatever leather could be found. Some villagers shared shears and needles, swapping thread for firewood, milk for flax. It was not just practical. It was communal. A kind of survival pact, and every item had meaning. A mother's woolen shawl wasn't just a wrap. It was an heirloom. It carried stories, smells, stains from last year's snow. A father's cloak, lined with rabbit fur, was passed down through generations, altered only slightly, carefully folded after each winter's end. because nothing was wasted. Not time, not effort, not warmth. Medieval people understood that luxury wasn't in having more, it was in making more from less. They believed in layering, not just clothes but lives. You wore wool over linen, fur over wool. You walked close behind others to catch their warmth. You sat in corners of rooms where the walls blocked wind. You lit a single candle not just for light, but to warm your hands. Sometimes the old tricks were the only ones that worked. Rub a slice of onion on frozen feet to restore circulation. Line your boots with sheep dung. Yes, sheep dung because it's warm and insulating when dry. Chew on juniper bark to fight off the chill from inside. Heat a spoon over fire and hold it against your chest. Not for any healing reason, but just to remember what heat feels like. And sometimes warmth had to be imagined. That's what the monks said. In the scriptoriums, their fingers turned blue. Ink froze in pots. Breath turned every chant into fog. Yet they continued, copying ancient texts, illuminating manuscripts, wrapped not in comfort, but in discipline. Because to them, cold was a kind of penance, path to clarity. They believed suffering revealed the truth of the soul. And so they wrote even when their hands shook, even when their feet went numb beneath their robes, even when candles burned down to their last inch. They wrote about Christ, about judgment, about mercy, and they did it cold because they believed the truth must be earned. Outside, peasants prepared in different ways. They didn't have libraries or larders full of ink, but they had wisdom, learned not from books but from the body, from pain, from years when a single mistake had cost someone their life. They knew which herbs warmed the blood, knew how to stack hay around a hut to insulate the wind, knew when to risk the fire higher and when to keep it low to save wood for later. They also knew that the cold played tricks, made people sleep too deeply, made fire feel optional until it was too late. That's why children were taught not just to be careful, but to be vigilant, to wake up early, to check the embers, to listen for the wind in the cracks of the door. Because sometimes winter did not announce itself with snow. Sometimes it came silently, in the middle of the night, through a forgotten gap in the door, through a missed prayer, through an ember left to die. And when it came, the only thing that mattered was whether you were ready. Readiness was not just a matter of supplies. It was a mindset. In medieval villages, survival depended as much on attitude as on action. There was no room for complaints, no space for despair. Winter didn't care if you were tired. It didn't care if your fingers cracked or your joints ached. It demanded respect, and it demanded endurance. So the people braced themselves not just with cloaks but with rituals. Before the first deep freeze, there were small feasts, not of indulgence, but of defiance. Apples roasted in coals, bread thick with last season's honey, old songs sung louder than the wind outside. It was a way to remind themselves, we are still here, we are still warm, we are still together. Then the long quiet began, and in that quiet, warmth became something you earned. A child fetched wood and earned a place near the hearth. A wife spun wool and earned another log on the fire. A husband repaired the roof and earned the right to hold his wife close. Even the smallest acts became sacred. The mending of a glove, the folding of a blanket, the setting of stones around the fire pit to reflect back the heat. But it wasn't always enough. Sometimes the cold broke through, and when it did, it didn't just take fingers or toes. It took morale. A neighbor found frozen. A child coughing blood from a frostbitten lung. A man so weary he lay down in the snow and never rose. These were not stories. These were warnings, passed down like prayers. Because winter wasn't just something you lived through. It was something that haunted you long after. Even in spring, villagers walked with a caution that couldn't be unlearned. Even when the sun returned, the memory of frost clung to the bones. That's why every act of warmth was treated like a miracle. When a fire caught easily. When stew simmered without smoke choking the room. When socks, if you had them, came back from washing without freezing stiff on the line. These were victories. Small ones, quiet ones, but real. And the truth is, socks weren't always missing. But when they existed, they weren't the cozy comfort we imagine. They were coarse, unshaped, woven from rough wool or felted hair. Often they didn't cover the whole foot. They bunched, they tore, they wore thin fast. So instead, most turned to layers. Cloth wrapped tight, rags soaked in fat for insulation, or nothing at all. Bare feet on stone floors were not a punishment. They were normal. In monasteries, monks walked barefoot through cold cloisters as an act of devotion. In homes, children ran barefoot over frozen ground, calloused and red. The idea of comfort was not warmth. It was survival without damage. A foot that could still walk. A toe that could still move. That was enough. They hardened themselves not because they liked it, but because they had no other choice. Because to show weakness to the cold was to invite death. And still, somehow, they found joy. Laughter around the hearth. The sound of icicles dropping from the eaves. The way the snow made even the filthiest village look clean for a few days. There was beauty, too, in the way smoke curled into a silver sky. In the hush that fell over the land when snow blanketed everything. In the stillness, because winter stripped the world to its bones. And in that silence, people found themselves again. Found their limits, their strengths, their fears, and sometimes their faith. Because what else can carry you through months of darkness and cold, if not the belief that warmth will return? Not just to the earth, but to the body, and to the heart. In the darkest months, when the sun vanished before supper and dawn came late, sluggish, behind gray skies, the world seemed suspended. Frozen not just in temperature, but in time. And that's when stories mattered most. Because stories were heat. They were light when candles were scarce. Courage when the wind howled. Memory when the cold made even yesterday feel distant. In cottages clustered like huddled sheep, families gathered close. Not just for body heat, but for the warmth of words. A grandmother would begin softly, her voice rasped with age, weaving a tale older than memory, of a hunter who chased the wind and found spring sleeping beneath the ice, of a woman who fed a starving fox, and in return was gifted a fire that never died, of a barefoot saint who walked through snow without shivering, because his faith burned hotter than flame. Children listened, wide-eyed. Adults listened too, pretending they had heard the story before, but still waiting to see if the ending had changed. Because stories, like winter, were never the same twice. They were told differently when bellies were full, or when the fire burned low, or when someone had just died. Sometimes the tales gave warnings: don't follow lights in the forest. Don't whistle at night. Don't leave shoes near the fire, or spirits might borrow them and forget to return. Other times they carried hope. A legend of a robin who built his nest in a king's boot, keeping him warm through the coldest night of the year. A tale of an invisible cloak spun from silence and snow, which could shield the wearer from even the bitterest wind. In these stories, the cold was not just an enemy. It was a trial, a judge, a shadow with a voice. And to beat it, you needed more than heat. You needed wit, patience, luck, faith, and above all, each other. Because no one survives winter alone. That was the unspoken rule of every village, every family, every traveler who found shelter in a stranger's barn. Hospitality wasn't just kindness, it was duty. If you turned someone away in the snow, you were cursing them to die. And worse, you were bringing misfortune upon yourself. Because the cold had ears. It remembered cruelty. That's why even the poorest family would offer space near the fire. A crust of bread. A place on the floor. Because warmth shared was warmth multiplied. And because deep down everyone knew, one day they might be the one knocking. One day, they might be the one with frostbitten hands, eyes full of wind, begging for heat. And when that day came, they prayed the fire inside the door would still be lit. There were no rescue teams, no phones, no thermal gear. There were just people. And the ancient understanding that fire is sacred because it is fleeting. That's why a fire was never left untended. Even in the middle of the night, someone would wake, stir the coals, check the draft. It was like keeping watch over a sleeping god. Because if the fire died before dawn, everything else might too. And not just in the physical sense. Something in the spirit depended on that flame. Its glow, the sound, its smell of smoke and survival. It reminded them we are still here, not because we were lucky, but because we endured. There was a certain reverence in how fire was treated. It wasn't just heat. It was life condensed into a flicker, a silent companion through the longest nights. And in the cold, you came to understand how easily that life could slip away. A single gust through a cracked shutter could snuff it out. A moment of forgetfulness, patch of wet wood, a tired hand failing to feed the flame. So fire became more than practical, it became ritual. In some villages, they whispered blessings as they lit it. In others, they apologized to it when they failed to keep it alive. Children were taught to speak to the hearth like it had ears, because perhaps it did. And sometimes, just sometimes, it answered, in sudden bursts of warmth when it should have gone out. In the way it lit despite damp twigs and failing fingers. In the mysterious comfort that came from staring into the embers, as if they understood your suffering. Because winter had a way of shrinking the world, pressed everything closer. Families slept side by side, not out of affection, but out of need. Piled like spoons beneath thick layers of wool, fur, linen, whatever scraps could be sewn together. Feet tangled. Breaths mingled. Privacy vanished, but so did the worst of the cold. Even animals were brought in. Chickens under benches. A goat near the hearth. A pig in the corner wrapped in straw. Their heat was part of the household calculation. They were not pets, they were insulation. But they were also comfort. A heartbeat other than your own. And that mattered. Because in the dead of winter, the silence could be terrifying. No wind. No birdsong. Just the slow crackle of fire, the soft groan of timber, the distant howl of something that might be wolf, might be wind. People told themselves stories to survive that silence. But they also learned to listen to it. To read the creaks of their homes like omens. To hear the tone of footsteps in the snow and know if it was friend or stranger. To wake when the wind shifted because it might mean a storm, or worse, a thaw followed by a freeze, the kind that shattered roads and trapped carts in glass. Cold wasn't always steady. Sometimes it was cruel in its tricks. A warm day in January that coaxed people outside only to trap them in a night so bitter it stole the breath from their lungs. That's why no one trusted good weather in winter. They knew it could turn. Knew that the sun could be a liar. That a melting icicle might herald not spring but a deadly refreeze. So even on days that felt gentle, they kept their boots stuffed with straw. Kept a second cloak nearby. Kept firewood stacked near the door. Because winter didn't fight fair. It waited. Watched. Tested your faith. And when it struck, it did so without warning. That's what the elders always said, winter is not a season, it's a mind. It thinks. It remembers. And if you forget that, it will remind you. Brutally. But there was another cold, one that didn't touch the skin, only the soul. It crept in when hunger lingered too long. When the firewood pile grew thin. When someone's cough didn't fade, but deepened. When the candle was burned to the wick and no one spoke of how they'd light the next. This cold could not be fixed with wool or cloaks or fire. This was the cold of despair. And in the medieval world, that was just as deadly. People spoke less. Moved slower. Eyes dulled even as they sat beside warmth. Because hope is a kind of heat too, and once it flickers, everything else begins to chill. That's why communities mattered. Why even the most stoic man would share his last dry log with a neighbor. Not out of pity, but because he knew next time it might be him. So villages functioned as one living body. Each cottage a cell. Each person a heartbeat. If one part grew cold, the whole suffered. And the warmth that survived longest was the warmth passed from hand to hand. You could see it in the way old women taught the young how to layer rags around the calves to keep blood flowing. How a boy might rub his sister's feet with lard to keep frostbite at bay. How a priest, though starving himself, would insist the last bit of broth go to the sick. Compassion was the only insulation no storm could breach. And yet, not all winters were survived. There were years so cold the rivers froze to their beds. So cold, birds fell mid-flight. So cold, oxen died standing, icicles on their lashes. Those years were remembered in names. The Black Winter. The Hunger Moon. The Frost of Bones. And for generations, those names carried weight. Children born in those winters were whispered about, as if they carried the chill in their very veins. As if the frost had touched their souls before their first breath. But those same children grew up tougher, less sentimental, more cautious. They knew the feel of cold through the womb. Knew what it meant to be swaddled not in cloth, but in hardship. And somehow they endured. Because that's the paradox of the medieval winter. It was both the killer and the teacher. Both the enemy and the sculptor. It carved people down to their truest forms, stripped them of illusion, pride, luxury. What was left? The will to live, and the wisdom to know what mattered. A dry corner of a bed, a spoon of broth, a friend who wouldn't leave you to freeze. Those were riches. Everything else was noise. You could see who understood winter and who merely hoped to survive it. The ones who understood didn't waste movement. They didn't speak too much, didn't leave the door ajar, didn't burn all their logs on the first cold night. They moved like people who'd danced with the cold before and remembered its rhythm. And then there were others. Nobles, sometimes, who thought stone walls and servants could keep the frost out. They'd wear silks beneath their furs, jewels on cold hands, drink wine beside fires tall as men. But the cold found them too. Drafts that curled under castle doors. Ice that crept down the bedchambers. Servants who grew too ill to serve. Fires that didn't catch because the wood had been stored damp. No title could warm you if you didn't know how to bank a flame. No wealth could help if your boots froze beside the bed and cracked by morning. And sometimes it was the humblest who lived longest. The widow with her clay stove and her sleeping dog. The shepherd who slept under 3 blankets and a sheepskin. The baker who left the oven door open just enough to heat the stones beneath the table where his children slept. They knew the old tricks. Not written in books, but passed through hands. A foot wrapped in dried moss changed twice a day to wick the sweat. A woolen scarf soaked in vinegar and hung by the window to keep the air sharp and clear. Stones warmed by fire, wrapped in cloth, and placed beneath blankets as primitive hot water bottles. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. Even body heat was planned like a resource. Children slept head to foot to share warmth more evenly. People shared beds not for pleasure, but for protection. Skin against skin was the oldest furnace of all. And in the dark, no one cared about shame. Survival didn't have room for modesty. And when the night was worst, when the wind sounded like screams through the thatch, when frost climbed the walls, when even the fire seemed afraid to burn, then the people didn't just cling to each other. They sang. Old hymns. Work songs. Rhythms that reminded the body to keep moving, even if just swaying in place. Because movement meant blood. And blood meant life. They didn't sing to sound beautiful. They sang to stay alive. Sometimes their voices were the only thing that reminded them they were human. That beneath the layers of dirt and wool and silence, there still beat a heart that remembered joy. And that's what winter couldn't kill. Not entirely. Even if it numbed the fingers. Even if it took the livestock. Even if it froze the wells. There was always a song too stubborn to stop. And it wasn't just about surviving one night. Winter in the medieval world was long. It wasn't a postcard season. It wasn't about snowflakes and cheer. It was a slow grinding test stretched over months where every day felt like a negotiation. How many coals could be spared for bread? Would the meat last until the next trade? Could the child make it through the cough without fever? Could the roof take another storm? And worst of all, would the thaw come in time? Because sometimes the cold lingered too long. Spring, that trembling promise, could be delayed. Gardens would lie still beneath frozen ground. Seeds refused to sprout. The warmth would come, then vanish, then tease again, each time reminding you that nature did not care about your hope. That's when the real hunger set in. Not the early winter hunger. That was expected, prepared for. People knew how to ration through December. But March hunger? That was cruel. Because it came when everyone was already frayed. When supplies had run out. When people began to measure time in stomach growls and hallucinations. When the body had already begun to eat itself. That's when they opened the last jar of turnips. Boiled the bones a final time. Ate bark. Chewed leather softened in broth. And sometimes there were worse things. Stories survived. Not in church books, but in whispers. Of neighbors vanishing. Of children not waking. Of meat in pots no one could explain. Desperation turns the mind into something unrecognizable. And the cold, it doesn't judge. It just waits to see what you'll become. But not everyone broke. Somehow many held on. Held fast to dignity. To decency. To faith. A mother would give her only crust to her child and smile. A brother would go without so his sister might recover. A stranger would knock and be let in even when there was almost nothing left to give. Because what they understood was this. If you lose your soul to survive the winter, then spring will mean nothing. So they clung to goodness like it was kindling. Fed it sparingly. Carefully. Kept it alive. And when the first true thaw came, when a bud pushed through the frost, when the ice cracked open and water sang again, it wasn't met with cheers. It was met with silence. A long, breath-held moment of disbelief. And then quiet thanks. Not to the sky. But to each other. To the ones who didn't leave. The ones who carried, watched, prayed, sang. Who kept the stories alive. Who kept the fire from going out. Because in the end, it wasn't the wool or the cloaks or even the food that saved them. It was each other, even the land bore scars from the cold. You could see it in the gnarled trees, whose branches twisted not just from age, but from winters spent under ice-heavy skies. In the stones that cracked and split where frost had entered and expanded. In the ruined roads and sunken paths carved by melted snow turned to floods. And people learned to read these signs. A bowed fence post meant frost heave below. A hollow-sounding step meant thaw had softened the ground, dangerous for carts, deadly for horses. The earth itself spoke of winter's passing, but it spoke in warnings, not celebration. And people listened. They'd seen too many false springs. So even after the snow melted, caution ruled. No one planted too early. No one used up their last stores too quickly. Because spring might return to winter in a single night. And sometimes it did. Frost would come back with a vengeance in April. Blades of new grass would shrivel. Newborn lambs would die in the fields. And once again, the people would gather inside, silently knowing they had hoped too soon. So they developed rituals to protect the transition. Charms were buried under threshold stones. Bread was hung over doorways to keep out lingering spirits of frost. Bonfires were lit not for heat, but to frighten away the cold's final ghost. These rituals weren't just superstition. They were psychological armor. A way to say, we see you, winter. And we're still here. Because the true terror wasn't just in the freeze, but in forgetting how to face it. And memory was everything. That's why knowledge was passed not in books, but by mouth. From grandmother to grandchild. From hunter to apprentice. From mother's hand on a child's foot demonstrating how to wrap rags with ash to prevent rot. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. People didn't need fairy tales to respect the cold. They just needed to live through one winter. The lessons were branded into bone. That's why, even in the middle of summer, there were signs of winter everywhere. A cellar stocked with dried beans. A stack of wool ready for mending. A row of boots drying in the sun, stuffed with straw to hold their shape. And beneath it all silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of people who remembered what it cost to be warm. And who were already preparing for when the frost would return. Because it always returned. It never stopped at the door. Winter never truly left the medieval world. It was less a season and more a presence, a shadow that shaped every moment, every breath, every choice. And those who lived then did not simply endure the cold, they learned to listen to it. The cold taught patience, a slow, aching kind that no fire could chase away. It taught ingenuity as hands made boot linings from straw, patched cloaks with scraps, and turned bones into broth so thin it was nearly invisible warmth. It taught community, for no hearth burned bright without the sharing of stories, the passing of traditions, the coming together in silence when words failed. And in that silence, there was respect, a deep, wordless understanding that the frost was not an enemy to be defeated, but a trial to be met. So they prepared. Not just with clothes or food, but with hope sharpened by memory. They knew the frost would return again and again. But they would be ready. Because survival without socks was never just about the feet. It was about the spirit. The warmth that no winter could freeze. And that more than any cloak or fire is the true story of how medieval people survived the cold.